Though boxing is known as the sweet science, there's nothing sweet about taking a punch from these guys. Some are slick, some are just plain ugly. All carry legendary punching power. In no particular order, here are 8 of the biggest one-hitter quitters in the sport. Julian Jackson. When a puncher as esteemed as the legendary Mike Tyson is telling the world that you hit like a heavyweight, you know you've done something right. And for the famed former middleweight champion Julian Jackson, to say that he had dynamite in his hands would be putting it lightly. Though he ranks among the smaller athletes on our list, Jackson's knack for blasting his opponent's lights out solidified his status as one of the most infamous punchers of his era. Now, of course, the more wily pugilists on his record were able to weather this guy's early storm, opponents such as former champions Gerald McClellan and Mike McCallum. And when you look at Jackson's 6 stoppage losses, it's easy to see that his great punching power came at the expense of elite durability. It was often a case of trying to survive Jackson before eventually taking control of the bout. But even with his shortcomings, Julian Jackson's pound-for-pound power was undeniable, and with an 89% knockout ratio, he certainly put his gifts to good use. Seriously, take a look at any of this guy's highlight reels, and you'll see why he's held in such high regard. Jackson was the type of puncher who could separate one's soul from their body, and in his heyday, that made him a truly scary proposition. Rocky Marciano. The 5'11" tall, 190-pound Rocky Marciano would barely be a cruiserweight by today's standards. But through the late 1940s and early 1950s, he was able to carve out a uniquely impressive place in boxing history. Marciano left the sport as the only heavyweight champion to retire undefeated and is still the owner of the highest knockout percentage in heavyweight championship matchups to this day. And boy, could he crack! Usually outmatched physically to some extent, Marciano's superb conditioning and relentless mindset was augmented by his freakish punching power. Some people are just born strong, and in the case of this undefeated legend, his small stature did not deter him from dealing out ridiculous punishment on his foes. Marciano was never the slickest fighter, nor was he truly defensively savvy, but he would eat your best shots, scrape himself off the canvas if needed, and make sure that he took his opening when it arrived. And with punching power like his, he rarely needed to find it more than once. Marciano did what few could do, leaving the sport on top, and to this day is remembered fondly as one of its all-time greats. Mike Tyson. Admit it, as soon as you see the words hard hitter and boxing together, your first thought will usually drift to Mike Tyson. And though there have been, indeed, more devastating knockout artists pound for pound, there truly have not been many. Iron Mike was an absolute nightmare in his prime, a force of pure fury that sought to decapitate his opposition by any means necessary. As fast and explosive as any heavyweight in history, Tyson had power in both hands, a uniquely effective style that saw him spring from a closed defense without warning, bobbing and weaving to throw his opponents off in his trademark peekaboo approach. Indeed, a stint in jail robbed us of his best years, but when Tyson was the hammer and not the nail, he was as devastating a knockout artist as could be. Every punch was delivered with pure force, his left hook, his right uppercut, and every shot that fell in between. With more iconic knockouts than perhaps anyone else on this list, Tyson was terror incarnate during his years in the pro game, and rightly recognized as one of the hardest hitters in boxing history. People flocked to Tyson fights with the expectation of seeing a knockout. It wasn't a matter of if, it was a matter of when that blow would land. He was a box office darling and an icon that had a penchant for delivering the goods in violent fashion. Thomas Hearns. When it comes to the legendary Tommy the Hitman Hearns, it's not just a matter of how he managed to score the knockouts he did. It's also a matter of who he managed to score them on. A sniper of the highest caliber, Hearns' length and overall leverage on his shots made him the perfect assassin. Speed kills, and in the case of Hearns, who managed to knock out the famously iron-chinned Roberto Duran, among others, it was his speed that took his already phenomenal mechanical ability to another level. It could well be said that very, very few fighters within the weight classes he operated in has brought that same level of perfect punching ability to such a high level since. And when you consider his general ring savvy, fight IQ, and ability to compete as high as light heavyweight, Tommy Hearns was far more than just a hard puncher. He was a warrior in there, one who did not shy away from the challenges that surrounded him in what was a hugely competitive time for the sport. And let's be real, is there a better and more fitting nickname in boxing history than the Hitman? Sonny Liston. Though sometimes overshadowed due to his demise at the coronation of the great Muhammad Ali, what made that victory so stunning was that Ali was not supposed to win. Sonny Liston was the one who was set for greatness at that point in time, coming off a pair of first-round knockouts of Floyd Patterson. And though he never recovered his titles after losing to Cassius Clay, Liston was a powerhouse without equal during that time period, through the late 50s and early 60s. Though he stood at a relatively humble 6'1", he held a gargantuan reach of 84 inches, a trait that allowed him to punch with leverage that just wasn't natural. Liston was built to separate men from their consciousness, forged for the singular purpose of scoring knockouts. And though his name will forever be associated with the greatness of the man who embarrassed him thoroughly in Ali, don't make the mistake of understating Liston's abilities as an all-time great puncher. He had power in both hands, a truly lethal application of the jab, and was strong as an ox. They don't make him like Sonny Liston these days, that's for sure. Deontay Wilder. Okay, he might not be everybody's cup of tea in terms of both his boxing fundamentals and his plethora of excuses after the second Tyson-Fury fight. But if Deontay Wilder can be praised for a moment, no fighter of this era, pound for pound, carries a more devastating shot in their hands than the Bronze Bomber. A late starter in the sport of boxing, Wilder's shortcomings in certain areas of the sport are as clear as day to anyone who knows what they're looking for. But even in the high-profile fights that he was losing, namely his clashes with Tyson Fury and Luis Ortiz, Wilder's knack for finding his mark cannot ever be ruled out. That depth of punching power is always a factor. And though Deontay was largely left nullified by Fury in their rematch, that doesn't take away from his frankly ridiculous ability to generate force. That right cross is already the stuff of legend, making him a box office hit in the United States. He might not be the slickest or most technically sound fighter in the game, but the Bronze Bomber is a top 10 puncher of all time, without question. George Foreman. They told me you could hit as hard as Joe Louis. Those were the famous words spat at George Foreman by Muhammad Ali as he taunted his opponent into tiring himself out in that legendary matchup in Zaire. And sure, Ali was never going to give Foreman the satisfaction of knowing just how bad those shots hurt, but Foreman's spot as one of the hardest hitters of all time was already set in stone. On the back of performances that saw him thoroughly crushing guys like Joe Frazier and Ken Norton, Foreman had an aura that was already on a level unlike anything seen in the sport up until that point. He battered his opponents to both the head and body without discriminating, putting all of his hulking 6'3" frame into his shots. And even though that 1974 defeat at the hands of Ali would result in a hiatus and a long-term failure to recapture his past glories, the fact that Big George was able to reclaim a heavyweight belt nearly 2 decades later is a testament to his amazing skills as a boxer. They say that speed and reflexes are the first to leave you with age, but power is the last thing to go, and George Foreman was as hard a puncher as the best of them. Ernie Shavers. The man named by the Associated Press as the puncher of the century in 1999 had all of the tools in his arsenal to back it up. The name Ernie Shavers was, at one point in time, synonymous with vicious knockouts. And while his right hand has been pointed to as perhaps the single deadliest weapon in boxing history, Shavers could certainly do damage with his left too. And whether he was looking for that kill shot or working the body, getting in there with Ernie Shavers in his prime was about as undesirable a matchup as they came. Even guys like Muhammad Ali and Larry Holmes, champions who bested Shavers, both were forced to take some tremendous punishment in order to get their hand raised. Ali even famously said that Shavers was the single hardest puncher he ever faced, a man capable of dishing out a greater level of force than even the legendary George Foreman. If that's not proof of this man's merits as the single hardest hitter in the history of the sweet science, I don't know what is. A force of sheer destruction, and through his 68 knockout wins, a man who holds a special place in the pantheon of boxing greats. He didn't rise to the top of the heavyweight pile at any point in his career, but if we're talking about raw punching talent, Ernie Shavers is the king, that's for sure.